FES पाकिस्तान के ताउन से रीजनल पीस एंड सिक्योरिटी डायलॉग की एक नई सीरीज़ का एहतमाम किया जा रहा है। इस सीरीज़ में हम पाकिस्तान के मुख्तलिफ एक्सपर्ट को मदऊ करेंगे जो कि अपनी राय से दुनिया की बदलती हुई सूरत हाल के ऊपर अपना तबसरा देंगे और आपको उसके ऊपर आगाह करेंगे। इस वक्त दुनिया के मुख्तलिफ ममालिक जिसमें इंडिया, पाकिस्तान, अफगानिस्तान, ईरान, चीन, यूरोपियन यूनियन के ममालिक, अफ्रीका, वहाँ पर बहुत सारी चेंजेस हो रही हैं। तो हमारे एक्सपर्ट उन चेंजेस के ऊपर अपनी राय से आपको आगाह करेंगे। अगर उनकी राय आपको पसंद आती है तो FES के नीचे दिए गए जो लिंक्स हैं उनको आप लाइक करें, सब्सक्राइब करें और उस पर अपनी राय का इजहार करें। FES पाकिस्तान पिछले 30 सालों से जमहूरियत और जमहूरियत को परवान चढ़ाने वाली बाकी इक़दार के ऊपर काम कर रहा है और हम आगे भी इस पर काम करते रहेंगे।
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Regional Peace and Security Dialogue. Today we have a very special guest in studio with us. We have Mr. Jason Brownlee. Jason Brownlee is a professor of politics at the University of Texas in Department of Government. He focuses on Middle East, democracy, authoritarianism, and he teaches American foreign policy vis-a-vis Middle East, Pakistan and Afghanistan. So thank you, Mr. Jason Brownlee, giving us the time.
It's my pleasure.
So first thing first, what brings you Pakistan?
Well, I was interested in getting perspectives outside of what I've heard in the United States, even with all of my research, reading the books that come out, reading the academic articles. It's great to talk to people in one of the major countries of the region, one of the key countries of the region.
So I was reading your bio. You have written 3 books, and your focus was on authoritarianism and democracies, and then Arab Spring, and then U.S. and Egypt's, relationship.
Exactly.
So talking about Arab Spring, and most of the people they were thinking that it's an organic movement that would bring back democracy in Arab states. But after a decade or so, if we look back, we see in those states hardly this democracy restored. So what went wrong, if I could ask you, during Arab Spring or after that?
Well, I think there's a lot we could talk about with the Arab Spring. Let's think about Egypt and Tunisia for the moment. If we think about what happened in Egypt, there are many who would say, even with the setbacks that Egyptians have experienced after 2011, after 2013, that there was no way the country could really progress under Hosni Mubarak. And just getting rid of Hosni Mubarak and preventing what looked like a sure path toward a dynastic succession to his son was itself an important break and an incredible achievement by millions of Egyptians who participated in that. So then the question is, okay, you've gotten rid of Mubarak, what comes next? And then I think that's where we see the difficulty in establishing civilian-led multi-party systems. And I think the history of Egypt is still unfolding, and when people look back, they will see 2011, 2012, and 2013 as important steps. But to get to the level that Tunisia has experienced, where you at least have a solid decade of multi-party rule and you don't have as much dominance by the military, that can take generations in some cases. So even though we can see a lot of activism and excitement over a short time, and that can be very important, there's still more work to be done kind of under the surface of politics in terms of more gradual social change.
So, but then if you're talking about that, you need to do a lot of work, gradual work. But take the example of Egypt.
Yes.
So they were successfully removed Hosni Mubarak. But what next? What do they have now?
Right. They did not remove the overall regime of military rule. They did not succeed in establishing civilian sovereignty. And that was clear even in March of 2011, which was my first visit to Egypt after Mubarak had been overthrown, where the military was really calling the shots during the transition and the military remained dominant under the one-year presidency of Mohamed Morsi, which culminated in the coup, and President Assisi's, or General Assisi's rule, and then he became a president shortly into that rule.
Well, let's go back to 2003, the Iraq invasion. Let's discuss about that. You know, American and West, they came over there, they attacked Iraq under the guise of weapons of mass destruction, and then they wanted to remove a dictator and want to install democracy. So that project also failed miserably. So what went wrong over there? What are the factors of failure of US and West to, you know, have a democratic government in Iraq? And we see it's a mess so far.
Right, absolutely. The United States, and I think many foreign powers that go into other countries, have a stronger record on obliterating and smashing a dictatorship than they do delivering something that is democratic. And what we've seen in Iraq, where it was basically 100% foreign intervention, and Libya, where it was like, we could say 50-50 foreign intervention and local
and in Syria,
resistance.
maybe 25%.
Yes, yes. But in these cases, what's happened is a shift from dictatorship to civil war, and Iraq now has a stable majoritarian elected system. I think that's what one could say about it. Libya has political negotiations.
But the cost they have paid, like Iraq, the cost they have paid, rise of ISIS, and then, you know, the divide in the society and the kind of killings we have seen over there.
Right. And current conservative estimates would be 1 million Iraqis dead from the war itself. So I think that poses some very difficult questions about what the path forward is for countries like Iraq, Syria, and Libya that have very repressive dictatorships, but may not have in the short term an easy path to democracy. If we look at, or not even just democracy, just kind of like constitutional, less repressive rule. If we look at the countries in, whether you take Europe or Latin America or Southeast Asia, Africa as well, the places that really have moved towards multi-party systems have substantial social, economic, and institutional underpinnings that take generations to build for them really to be robust. And so it just doesn't happen overnight. And if you try to force it through this kind of radical change, like just tearing up the state, getting rid of the Ba'ath Party, just getting rid of Gaddafi, smashing the Libyan state, you're more likely to end up with a protracted civil war.
And through external interventions, what elements were missing in that external intervention of US and other countries in Middle East, which ended up in this kind of mess in all those countries? You're saying 100% intervention in Iraq, maybe 50% in Libya, 25% in Syria, but the end result is almost same everywhere.
Yes.
You have civil war, you have millions of people getting displaced and hundreds of thousands of getting killed.
Right, and of course, and if we move beyond the Arab world, Afghanistan looms large as an example. So I would almost say we could flip the question on its head and ask, in what cases has this ever worked? They are rare and few. And in those cases, what were the conditions? And were Iraq and Afghanistan anything like that? The two main cases that the Bush administration liked to invoke are the ones that everyone turns to: the post-World War II reconstruction of Germany and Japan. But in those cases, there was a fundamentally different tradition. These were not failed states with strong ethnic cleavages running through them. These were defeated empires. They were actually quite successful as states. And what the United States did in those cases is very interesting. Rather than just getting rid of the old regime completely and just like putting everyone in jail or refusing to talk to them, the U.S. brought them into the political process and actually delegated to local elites, to sort of the indigenous elites, if you will, the ability to steer the transition. So within months, the U.S. was saying to the Germans, this is Nazi Germany, this is in 1945 still we're talking, they were saying, you know, you can basically run the denazification program. So you can sort of pick who gets punished and who doesn't. And then that continued, and so you actually have tremendous continuity. It was a source of frustration for many American political scientists at the time because they saw these Nazis were going to be running the new state. In Japan, the example is even more stark, where Emperor Hirohito himself is maintained as the symbol of continuity and this fundamental leadership role for the whole society. So quite different from what we saw with de-Baathification, or we could say sort of de-Talibanization in Afghanistan.
So you talked about Germany and Japan and the interventions over there. But in Germany, you know, everything was followed. It was a process, and then there was Marshall Plan as well. But why does it's missing in Middle East and Afghanistan? And then people blame that the treatment mattered to maybe Muslim world or the states where Muslim majority state is different, and with the other states is different, when even with the foreign interventions.
Well, I would say those who are looking at the Muslim world or the Middle East and South Asia and looking only at those interventions I would encourage them to look more broadly, because actually the record of U.S. failure in intervention extends back over a century. The U.S. invaded the Philippines in 1898, and although it eventually developed a decent political relationship with the country, there was tremendous violence for the first several years, 200,000 Filipinos killed by conservative estimates, and also invaded Cuba, occupied Cuba for decades, a source of bitterness between our countries, which remains to this day. And then during the Cold War, of course, you know, South Vietnam was absolutely a failed project to maintain an artificial state that did not have social support. And you could say it's similar to the attempt to maintain the Republic of Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021. So I think there are other cases. There are kind of historically specific reasons why U.S. aggression and intervention shifted to this region in the 1990s and the 2000s. But in other periods, there have been many other countries also similarly targeted.
But, you know, coming back to Middle East, U.S. has always been a flag bearer of democracy in the world, human rights and everything. But when we see its relationship with the Middle East, there are some countries having authoritarian rules from like decades, and U.S. has a very good relationship with them. So why does U.S. make compromises on the democratic and human rights norms when it comes to some countries in the Middle East, and has a different standards for the other countries in the same region?
Well, generally speaking, the U.S. approaches democracy or human rights as secondary considerations, and it views them through the prism of other interests. So, for example, in the end of the Obama administration and at the early Trump administration, when Omar Bashir was still in power in Sudan, Omar Bashir, who had been accused of the first genocide of the 21st century, the U.S. was moving to lift sanctions, to restore relations, as long as Omar Bashir could move away from North Korea. So oftentimes the question is like, what are you doing for us or against us in terms of international relations? And that determines whether or not we're going to be tough on you. So in my work on the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, I noticed that when it came to, you know, what you're talking about as being the flag bearer of democracy during the Bush administration of 2001 to 2009, when it came to that issue in Egypt, all that fundamentally mattered was whether Egypt was serving Israel's security. So if Egypt was not serving Israel's security, then it would be criticized for human rights abuses a little bit more. There would be threats of cutting off economic aid. But as soon as the Egyptian government moved aggressively to stop the tunnels that Hamas was using to smuggle weapons and supplies into Gaza, then the pressure was off.
And you bring in, Israel's question. So excessive made by some states everywhere in the world are tolerated by the U.S., especially like when it comes to Israel. But then again, its treatment with different countries is different on the same kind of pretext. So you have already answered to some extent of that question, but specifically talking about Israel. So why U.S. is so protective about Israel?
Okay, well, first let me address this general issue of kind of double standards. I would say the only difference about double standards, they are constant. The only difference is whether spokespersons for the U.S. government are hiding them or bragging about them. I mean, Jeane Kirkpatrick famously wrote an article and then a book called Dictatorship and Double Standards. We should have just kept supporting the Shah. We should have kept supporting Somoza in Nicaragua. This is ridiculous for Carter to put any pressure on these leaders. By the way, I don't accept that he was really putting pressure on these leaders, but that was Kirkpatrick's perception because they fell to domestic revolutions. And so she was saying, yes, this is the Cold War. We absolutely should have double standards. Then other times they're more coy. They're saying, no, we try to have a consistent standard, but the world is complicated. Now, the source of the the U.S.-Israeli partnership goes back decades. I mean, obviously there was a relationship right there at the start with the recognition of the State of Israel, but it really kicks off and grows after 1967, where Israel demonstrates that it's the military hegemon of the region. And the U.S. sees in Israel a military ally that can be pretty reliable in terms of its government, its political system. So there are lots of sources of that relationship, but I really would point to the shift that happens after 1967.
So let's come to Iran, from Israel. So you have been studying and teaching about Iran as well. You traveled to Iran. So these recent protests, what do you make out of them? So do you think this revolution could be reversed and these protests, they could make a headway, or you think they would ended up like the most recent in last 1 decade or so? We have seen 2, 3 instances where we have large protests, but at the end of the day they went back and the regime change could never happen there.
I think there are two ways to look at it. One thing about any kind of protest is one never knows long term what its impact can be, and they can be very significant in the moment, even if they don't in the specific month or year in which they're happening appear to extract concessions from people in power that they aim for. So for example, Occupy Wall Street was a really important moment of protest in the United States, even though it kind of fizzled out and in terms of its immediate goals. But it was very important symbolically. And I think what we've seen in Iran since the late 1990s, student protests in 99, the Green Movement in 2009, and now this one, are moments of expression of very justifiable dissent among Iranians in a country of I think roughly 90 million people at this point. It's hard to see a protest that's in only kind of one urban center changing the political system, and if it doesn't sort of catch on to others, but to other cities and sort of spread in the countryside. But then again, it's sort of introducing ideas, it's pushing against red lines, it's changing the scope of politics, and that's very significant.
These protests, they have been getting a lot of support from the West. Do you think it's a kind of good by the West to support them? I think it's maybe there's so many who think that the current regime has been using this as an external factor. So more and more support coming from other countries means they can push it, they can discredit it with the more force. So how could we have this balance where when it comes to lift the bans, and when it comes to having a good kind of agreement on nuclear with Iran, there is a divide among the West. But when it comes to human rights, the voice would be very strong, and it gives a lot of space to the regime in Iran to externalize that problem, that some foreign agenda is behind these protests. So where that fine balancing line where West can make some interventions and then become more credible.
Yes, I think Western intervention or even Western attempts at like helping can be the kiss of death for indigenous movements for human rights, because it can look like you're a foreign pawn. My sense, I followed the Green Movement closely in 2009, and my sense then, and I think Biden is taking the same course, is while there might be statements coming out of the State Department or even the White House at times, that they're not really giving material support to the protesters. So in that respect, it's more kind of for optics and appearances than something substantive. Substantively, if the U.S. administration wanted to do something to help women in Iran, all women in Iran, the logical step would be to lift sanctions and stop the campaign of basically choking the Iranian economy that's been going on since the presidency of Jimmy Carter. So that would be a way to really help all Iranians, actually women and men, to live more prosperous and safer lives. And also, the more the United States and other countries can stop this siege against Iran of sanctions, the more they can open up a space for movement in a more democratic direction.
So, Professor, given there is a rise of authoritarianism and increased in popularity of right-wing populists, how do you see the future of democracy?
Well, there's a lot of things people can mean by democracy. So let's think about the minimal kind of democracy, which is you don't have one person or one party indefinitely in charge. You at least have some rotation of power between them, and that rotation of power happens through elections with an enfranchised populace that has basic civil liberties. So not necessarily, there may not be a welfare state, there may be rough conditions in other respects, but at least you have rotation of power. So this kind of political democracy or electoral democracy, I think, remains very robust, actually. I don't see a rise in authoritarian regimes around the world. If we think about authoritarian regimes as like a Sisi regime in Egypt, or a Saudi Arabian regime, or even China's single-party government, that mode of politics is not spreading. We don't see a lot of countries becoming consolidated around one faction, one leader. What we do see are countries that are still having rotation of power between parties, having a different kind of political debate than we're accustomed to. It tends to be a debate between mainstream, pretty old established centrist parties, and then newly emerging parties or new faces of old parties that revolve around some type of leader that may act kind of like a demagogue. We see that in Hungary, in India, to some extent in Poland, definitely in the United States with Trump, Brazil with Orban. People have made parallels here. And so that's what I see. You could call it right-wing populism, I suppose. Sometimes they're left-wing variants, but the right-wing variant seems to be the stronger of the two. But generally speaking, these leaders rise and fall, and the democracy keeps going. They don't engage in any type of real coup or shift toward authoritarianism. The exception that I would point out is, and it's only a partial exception, but I think it crosses the line, is Turkey under Erdogan, where you did have in 2016, basically, he pushes back against this coup with a massive wave of repression. And I think I think Turkey, you do have a form of authoritarianism now. But otherwise, I wouldn't say that Hungary is authoritarian, certainly not Brazil or the United States. But remember, we're dealing with a very basic definition of democracy, political democracy, which means there can be a lot of social challenges that still need to be addressed, and I think that's why these right-wing populists are doing so well, because the mainstream parties have not addressed that social aspect. And so people are saying, well, I've been voting for these other parties for decades and nothing's happening, so I'm just going to vote for the person with a sledgehammer who just wants to demolish the whole system.
So you're optimistic about democracy, and you're discussing what the characteristics of these populist leaders. So you think, this is my last question, the traditional democratic parties or traditional leaders, what does they miss, right? Charisma or something which why they're not so attractive, and why these new populist right wings are becoming so attractive to the masses. You have explained that they are trying to address the most pressing issues, but have you seen some specific characteristics among all those right wing populists?
Well, let me come to that, what their characteristics are. But first, on this question of optimism, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily especially optimistic. What I'm trying to push back against is, I think, an overblown perception of what the threat is. I don't subscribe to the comparisons with the interwar period of the 1920s and 1930s, or the rise of the Nazis in Germany. I don't think this is that type of moment. I think we're in, there's a trend, but it doesn't mean that that's a complete downward slope. It could be sort of ups and downs, kind of in a cyclical pattern. Now, what's happening with the rise of the populists, if this is a cycle, is that between the war in Iraq and the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Arab Spring wars and instability that caused, the worst human displacement in decades, between that and then the 2008 economic crisis, there have been profound material challenges that are put on these societies. And these governments have, and then that's not even to mention COVID, right, over the past few years. Rather than addressing these seriously, and I can just speak about my own country, the United States, the main parties have kind of twiddled their thumbs. Even, and I would even say, especially the party that's supposed to be kind of the left party, the Democratic Party, that's supposed to be kind of more on the side of the people. Like if we think, oh, Republicans are the party of business, Democrats are the party of the ordinary people. But then we see Nancy Pelosi being uncomfortable with stopping insider trading in Congress, many congressional representatives and senators being quite cozy with Wall Street, being against unions, being against labor movements. Then we see, like, okay, well, we had this 2008 economic crisis. The country was devastated. Like, what kind of allies do the ordinary people have? And so that's why I think, a portion of the country that you might think, well, they should be voting Democratic, is instead voting for someone far right wing like Trump.
Thank you, Professor Jason Brownlee, and that's all from today's episode. See you next time with some new guests and with a new topic. Until then, goodbye.